Okay, this first one is going to be on wavelength and frequency. And you might say, well, okay, I know what a frequency is. That's a channel, that's a designation. It's so many megahertz, it's so many kilohertz. But what do I need to know about wavelength? Well, we're going to find out wavelength's going to be pretty important to what we do. Okay. Why don't you just roll it slowly up to slide 3. 3? 5? You're on 5. Up in the upper, and it also, Stu's got it hidden down here in the corner, but you probably can't see that either. So, yeah, that's 3. So, and if you read the book, he makes an analogy about ocean waves, water waves. It's a good analogy. And he does describe it. The things that you as an amateur are going to really be interested in is electromagnetic waves are composed of 2 components, electric and magnetic fields. The electric field is a voltage, impressed voltage. Voltage is the way it's best described, 500 volts is a willingness to do work. Volts doesn't do anything. It's just a potential, and it's quite often referred to as potential. Current does work. So if you have high voltage, high currents, it's doing an enormous amount of work. That work might be a lightning strike blowing your tower up, but there's a lot of current there, but it's doing a lot of work. Or it might be running a motor, or it might be making your radio work. But current does work. Voltage is the potential for it. And we're interested in that E field or voltage field. The magnetic field has some value, and it's useful in other relationships. But as a ham, we want to know about that E field, that wavelength. And what is the wavelength of that field? It's the distance, okay, traveled by the electromagnetic wave in one positive cycle to the next positive cycle. So one full positive, negative cycle. That's going to be our frequency. We measure that in cycles per second. It's measured in hertz. A little later in here, we're going to see that they're going to abbreviate hertz with a capital H. That's the kilohertz, KHZ with a capital H, megahertz, MHZ with a capital H. And the way to remember that is hertz was a name. It was a gentleman's name. It's also the name of a car rental company, so there you go, capitalize it. Some guys will pick on you when you write them all out in lowercase or all uppercase. The correct term is capital H. The other 2 are lowercase. Not a big deal. Okay. We do talk about AC frequency in this. That has to do with the alternating current. It's alternating at a really, really high rate. Comes out of the wall at 60 cycles per second. It goes out on the air at 28 megahertz or 28 million cycles per second if we're on 10 meters. Okay, go to the next slide there. That's a question, though, that the electromagnetic, or the electric field, and the magnetic field, that's on the test. So, and by the way, the relationship to those 2, they're at right angles to each other. That's kind of a hard thing to envision, but if you can think about a field of energy going out vertically, that would be voltage or current actually flowing. And then the magnetic field, the strength of that is at right angles to it. So, we do talk about what's the wavelength versus frequency. Radio waves are one of the lowest frequencies that we really deal with, other than maybe earthquake, things like that. What you notice down here at the radio, we have it at 10,000 hertz on up into the million hertz. Microwave, we're really familiar with. Infrared, bacteria, molecular. This is getting rather esoteric, up into the gamma rays. But it's all the same. It's all measurable in wavelength, and it's all described in wavelength. So and they are the lowest. The relationship of the wavelength to the frequency, the lower frequencies have the longest wavelength. And they have the biggest antennas, of course, and we'll get into that a little later. Next slide. Can the wavelength be determined from the frequency? They're a direct correlation, so yes, we could do that. Here's the formula, And don't get tripped up. Again, that's a question on the exam. It says the wavelength in meters is 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. You have to express it in megahertz. Put the decimal point in the right point and then do the division. And in the example they have here, we have a 2 meter frequency, 146.52. It's a common simplex frequency. Wavelength, you end up with 2 meters. The frequencies that we use in the electromagnetic spectrum that we call radio, we refer to them by the meter band, 40 meter band, 80 meter band, 10 meter band. They're shortwave broadcasts that are in other meter bands. So again, they're referred to in the length of the wavelength. And why is that so important? Because that affects your antenna that you're going to want to use for it. So let's see. Okay, next slide. What do we have? Yep. Common prefixes. This is kind of setting you up on the test. The test will play games with the decimal points on, they'll tell you a frequency and then ask you what's the proper representation. Just understand that you know, they call this unity or hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and then you have to play game with a decimal point. I recommend that you review this section in your book and look at how to do the math. Stu's got some hints in there on how many places to move the decimal to the left or right, depending upon the frequency as it's expressed. So, next slide. Phase relationship. I'm not sure why he tossed that in here. Other than he's probably going to hit you when you get into the SWR section. He's going to talk about the phase relationship of a signal. If you have a RF signal, the voltage in most cases, it can also be current. It should be current, but anyhow, the voltage, as it's in this phase, you could have a reflection that will come back slightly out of phase. The phase shift will be dependent on the length of the transmission line and the impedance, and the amplitude of the reflection will be determined on the impedance mismatched at the other end. Phase, signals out of phase on the same transmission will combine somehow. If they're exactly equal and opposite, they completely cancel each other out. If they're slightly less amplitude, equal and not equal but opposite, they'll have some residual left. If they're slightly out of phase, that phase then starts to look like what we call SWR, and that's in another section. So, okay. Got the converting relationships. Yeah. Okay. What's a frequency band? Well, a band is going to be a continuous radio range of frequencies. For example, the 6 meter band covers 50 megahertz to 54 megahertz. So we're going to call that a band, a frequency band. And as amateurs, as the 6 meter band is one of our authorizations, we're going to have sub-bands within there. The FCC, in some cases, will indicate by rule what modes or what operation could be done in that subband. But as amateurs, we have further broken that down voluntarily and said we're going to put all of this kind of data activity here, and we're going to put this low scan TV here, and the voice is going to be here. There's no law on that. That's strictly a gentleman's agreement. You will occasionally find some operations, for example, the 80 meter sideband and 40 meter sideband, it's been traditional to use what they call upper sideband. That's because the radio equipment at the time, the way they made those sidebands, it was convenient for that to be upper. Yeah. Or I should say lower sideband. I'm confused, lower sideband. But what I'm going to say is you will find upper sideband operators in the 80 and 40 meter band. And you go like, well, why are they doing that? Are they doing that just to annoy everybody else? And you go like, no, that's because the radio they have has only upper sideband on it. It's a military radio or it's a commercial radio that has only upper sideband. If you buy a Collins, big fancy Collins, well not Collins, but Motorola, that the county governments could buy HF radios to use, they don't have lower sideband on the radios. They're all just strictly upper sideband. So the point is you don't holler at the guy because he's on the wrong sideband. He's on the only one he can use. But back to the story here. VHF frequencies, these are broad bands that are described here. You can go to the next slide. This is the amateur radio band plan as set out by the ARRL. And we'll look at the 10-meter band up here, for example. And we see that we have green from 28.3 to 29.7. And the green is phone and image. Well, what's image? Image is slow scan TV. Okay. It's actually a digital mode. But the FCC doesn't regulate by the way it's transmitted. They regulate but what the content of the signal is. An image is not considered digital data. It's an image. So it's sent in the sideband, the voice bands. It's a warbling tone that annoys some operators, but it's legal in that band. So we see that we have a yellow, a single sideband portion of it that's set aside for single sideband. And again, this is not hard and fast rules, but the reason they've done that is those frequencies will overlap with some European and other frequencies that are available for DX work. Single sideband works really good for DX and keeping an exclusive band, keeping the image guys out of there, make it easier to work the DX. And then we have Ridian data. And then, of course, with CW, there's no CW only. Technically, CW is available throughout the band. If you're a sideband operator, rag chewing with your buddy in Ohio, you may hear somebody practicing CW or talking CW a little bit above you. It's not illegal. It can be annoying, and he probably ought to move or find someplace where he's not going to bother anybody. But again, these band plans are voluntary. You should operate by them and should respect them, but there's times when the conditions are such that you can't, or maybe you're testing something new and trialing something new. So the point is don't become a cop on this particular mode. So let's see. Yep. Big thing in the question is the band plan is a voluntary band plan. So when you look at all the choices, the one that says voluntary is going to be the key one. Okay, let's see. Let's just go over the questions you're going to have here. The voice privileges, we talked about those. They're set up. They're marked out. Technician voice privileges are indicated. Let's see, single sideband phone may be used in some segments. That's a tricky question. These upper frequencies are quite often are used for FM voice communications. They work best there. It's better there. But there will be a question on a test, or could be, about single sideband phone used in the upper segments above 50 megahertz. Yes, you're likely to hear it. You could hear it. There's a lot of guys that's all they do is they'll get on 2-meter single sideband and they'll work a dozen states around them on sideband when the conditions are good. And they get, so. There are frequencies well up here. You'll see technicians that got class. This is technically up in what I call the microwave range, 1.2 gigahertz. You know, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Wi-Fi. Matter of fact, that is the Wi-Fi band. Okay. You can run a kilowatt in there if you want, by the way. On the amateur frequencies, they overlap, those two. But anyhow, but. That's got to play hell with the neighbor's Wi-Fi, though. Yeah, it would. And as a side note, it's kind of interesting. The Israelis developed a 2 kW Wi-Fi amplifier, okay. And they did it to jam cellular phones because it's in the same range over there roughly. And those were making their way into the US market, and people were putting up kilowatt Wi-Fi points. And it's, it's like crazy. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So, yeah. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. And here we go with a band plan. This is an example of the 2-meter band plan. And again, it's a voluntary band plan. They vary by state, by the way. When you get up into the 2-meter and above frequencies, or 6 meters and above, they will vary by state. The organizations within a state, usually it's a repeater council, will kind of take ownership of the band plan. And they are, although they have no legal standing authority, they do have the support by the majority of the amateur community in their state, so it might as well be a rule or law. And they kind of describe on where you should operate. Why do we have these band plans? These band plans are here so we can all have fun playing radio and know where to play it and not interfere with others, maybe playing conflicting modes. So, simplex channels. Simplex channel is a channel that is just on the same frequency. You're talking direct to each other, back and forth. You're not using an intermediate repeater site. Simplex, they'll be typically in a small community. You may have a half a dozen hams in the neighborhood all get on a simplex channel and rag chew after the evening meal and enjoy that. The repeaters are typically meant to extend your range. That has kind of morphed because of the, well, bluntly, it's because of the lack of the number of amateurs in communities. When they put up repeaters, they've linked them, and it's to extend the community that's able to communicate is being done through repeaters. But in the past, 50 years ago, if you were on a repeater talking to a guy across town that everybody knew that you could hit him on simplex, you'd get hollered at, like, what are you tying the repeater up for talking to George? You know, he's 2 blocks away from you. So anyhow, but we go through these. You can see Earth, EME, that's Earth, Moon, Earth, bouncing signals off the moon. Beacons, propagation beacons, these are normally CW beacons that are sending real slow speed Morse code. They send their call sign, they may send some other information. And it's on 2 meters, and it's sent CW. And you can tune into that, and when you have unusual atmospheric conditions that cause those beacons to propagate, you may hear Hollywood, California.
What is CW?
Morse code.
Okay.
Doo, 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 doo.
Okay. Code work, is that what does CW stand for?
Say again.
What does CW stand for?
Continuous wave, I'm sorry, continuous wave. It was, yep. Early, you know, Marconi days, they named it CW, continuous wave transmitters. That would,
okay, yeah, I was just wondering.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're fine.
I'd see, I've used it so long, it's just become a term. It's like Xerox. You know, what do you mean, what's Xerox stand for?
Yeah, I'm trying to work my way through the jargon slowly.
Okay. Well, you're going to have fun with that your entire career in amateur radio. So CW, general CW and weak signals. Earth, Moon, Earth, and other weak signals are in these range. National sideband calling frequency. So if you have you want to play and you've pointed your antenna up into Canada, and you got a little beam antenna for 2 meters. 2 meter beams are small, they're relatively inexpensive. You don't need to be really high, but they have tremendous gain, so they give you quite an advantage. You can call on 144.20, call CQ, and you may end up with somebody up at not as far as Yellowknife, but certainly, you know, you can probably get sidebands up out of the Canadians. They like to play sideband a lot. General sideband operation, Oscar. Oscar is a satellite, amateur radio satellite system.
Okay.
That's, the first Oscar was called Oscar, and they've generally called that ham satellites now are considered Oscar, and that's the Oscar band, and you'll have the satellites. Linear translator inputs. We can talk a bit more about a linear translator a little bit further, but a linear translator is a receiver that receives on one frequency. And in this particular case, we're going to receive from 144.5 to 144.6. megahertz. And it's going to have an output, linear transfer, and it's going to come out here. So if you were sending a signal in on 0.5, it's going to come out 145.1. Okay. So think of it as like a repeater, but it's a linear translator. It's not necessarily a full repeater. Linear translators are used in a lot of satellites. The advantage of a linear translator and the disadvantage is you have this band here, for example, from 0.5 to 0.6. That's 100 kilohertz. 100 kilohertz. So if you wanted to send a data signal 75 kilohertz wide, it would go through that and it would come out the other end. So that's the advantage of linear translators. All the milsats up there, all the military satellites are all linear translators. So we have a lot of trouble with bootleggers on them too, because you can talk on them, they comes out the other end. What goes in comes out, you know. So you can see down through the band. I won't go through everything, but this is an example of a band plan, and you end up with the how the band is broken up, where you should operate, what modes, and of course the repeater bands then generally become a repeater coordinating body's responsibility. So I think that's pretty much it. Okay, next slide. Technician license privileges. Where can you operate in what bands? You'll see down here on the HF or the low bands, you're going to have 80 meter privileges, which is going to be CW, Morse code. And I recommend you do it. Give it a try. You might like it. You know, it's like Mikey. Try it. 40 meter band, 15 meter band. These bands are all harmonically related. The 80 meter, 3 megahertz frequency, double that, puts you up in the 40 meg. 3 times puts you up in the 15 megahertz. Little history is early transmitters in the 30s, 40s, when hams were on there, they generated lots of harmonics. So if a ham was operating on the 80 meter band, you know, sending his Morse code, he was also probably sending energy on both those 2 bands too. So the FCC says, you're going to mess with yourself, mess with yourself. We're not going to assign those bands to some other service. We're going to let you interfere with your own amateurs. So there you go. We come up into the 10 meter band. 10 meter band is an HF band. When we have high active sunspot levels, the 10 meter band is quite active. 20 watts, 10 watts, 5 watts can get you across the United States on openings. I used to, the opening we had in, I'm trying to remember what it was in the late 80s, I would take my, I would park my truck. I had a little 20 watt, it was a CB radio that had been converted by the manufacturer and marketed as a 10 meter ham. And I would go sit at the coal dock in St. Ignace, and I'd work as many Europeans as I wanted to while eating my lunch on 10 meters. It was really great. And that was a little vertical stuck up there too. So 6 meter, again, you have CW privileges there as a technician. Then of course up here at the 200 mega, or 220 or 220, we refer to it. Then these are the higher frequency bands. The 70 centimeter band is typically as high as most of us up here will play. We call it UHF, this we call VHF. Up in the 900 megahertz and the 1.2 gig, there's not a lot of activity. I played with 1.2 gig with a friend of mine across town, but we were the only 2 guys in town that had the equipment, so it wasn't much fun.
Didn't they just move the police radios to a UHF band now?
Say again?
Didn't they just move the police radios to a UHF band? So we had to get new equipment at work.
Yeah, they refarming is what they're doing. They're moving things around. And what's happened is when they went to digital TV, that gave up a bunch of high VHF channels. Okay. And the cop shops are all moving into those frequencies there.
Better propagation that way?
No, actually it's worse.
Okay. Is there a reason why they're doing it then?
Digital service.
Okay.
They're moving to digital, which takes up more bandwidth per channel, and they're able to run multiple signals to a vehicle, for example. Okay. You can have traditional, we can think of it as internet data going to a device in the front seat. There can be vehicle location equipment, that's giving out the vehicle. It's separate signals all on that same channel in addition to the voice. And they're actually, by the way, the TV stations are being paid to move by the agencies that want to move into those frequencies. So, but that's a good point. Let's see. We do have some questions here. They're going to hit you there. They're going to 52 megahertz. Yeah, that's 6 meters. So that's kind of the clue. If you see this 52, wherever the 6 meter band is, 50 to 54. That's easy to remember. So if they give you a 50 to 54, it's going to be 6 meters. The answer to that, sideband phone may be used. Yep, it's probably true. 10 meter band is the only phone privileges. Yep, on the HF, that's back to phone. 10 meters considered HF, and it's the only phone. You can go 28.3 to 28.5.
So what are they talking about with the phone?
Just voice, microphone.
Just talking.
Just talking, yeah. This would be phone for general class and above licenses. This is technician and general classes and above. You don't have that exclusively. That portion is allocated for you. Typically, the other classes will stay out of there to let you have use of the band. But if skip is up and there's a chance to work a distant station, they'll certainly give you the opportunity. They'll be down there, trying to work it just as easily. So, well, here's some CW-only admissions. There are CW-only segments. So again, go through the book, read the book. I hesitate to tell you this, but I will. When you go through one of these modules, get the correct answer, go to the back of the book, and find the question, and does he have them in here? And then highlight, the correct answer in the book. You can print out the question pools.
Yeah, I found a couple sites online for that. So.
Yeah, and you can find the question. And what I found, candidly, I used it this way. I was doing a lot of traveling as an engineer. I was in the airplane a lot. I wanted to become an extra class ham, so I studied the extra class manual. And what I found the easiest thing to do is I took a felt marker and I marked out all the wrong answers.
That way you're not memorizing the wrong answers.
I'm not putting that wrong answer as in there. So I would just sit on the plane, read the text, go back, read the test, go through, look at the right answers, and that seemed to help. So, but review each one of these and kind of get in your mind, why is that the right answer? Next slide, please. Power limitations. The band plans, by FCC rules, the plans do dictate power. On these bands here, 1,500 watts is the maximum peak envelope power. Peak, yeah, right. And then, but that's on these bands up here. Down below here, on the HF bands where you have CW privileges, you're limited to 200 watts. That's typically not a problem because most of the radios are 100-watt radios, so you're not going to violate that. I would recommend that if you're doing CW, you don't need anything more than 100 watts. That's going to give you more fun than you know what to do with, probably. And trying to run an amplifier, most amplifiers are 500, 600-watt amplifiers in one family. They go to a kilowatt in another family, and then 1,500 watts. Trying to run any of the higher power amplifiers, even the 500, at 200 watts is problematic. It's not worth the hassle. So just, if you're going to play CW, and I do recommend you do Morse code. You do make an effort to at least practice it and get it, because it may open a whole new world for you. There is a restriction, a 60-meter band, but again, the 60-meter band's not open to technician classes. That's class for teaching, but it's limited to 100 watts. That is a shared band. Hams are secondary on that band. That is a government allocated band. The channels in that area are reserved for county governments, state governments, tribal governments talking with federal governments. They have their own HF network, and those channels are reserved for them and also The military auxiliary radio service, MARS, is on those frequencies as a primary user. So, okay, next slide. Okay, we covered, there we go. We covered the bands, frequencies, license privileges on the bands.